In this video, we're going to learn about the basic ideas of probability, and we will use these ideas again and again in the future. However, I will say that a lot of the things in this section specifically aren't going to carry over. Like we're rarely going to be asked to find sample spaces in the future. However, all of this is the base knowledge upon which you build all of the more complicated probability problems. So we're going to go ahead and start by understanding what a sample space is. So a sample space, this is just a list of all possible outcomes of a random experiment. So it really just depends on what you're doing here. Let's say you flip a coin. If you were to flip a coin, the sample space would be two outcomes, heads and tails. If you roll a dice, a typical six-sided dice, the sample space would just be the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So whatever thing you're doing here, if you were to write down all the possible outcomes that might happen when you did that random thing, that is called the sample space. And so as I said, when we get to more complicated problems, we're rarely going to write out all the possible outcomes. I mean, for example, if you think about playing poker and you're getting 5 cards from a deck of cards, there's hundreds or thousands of different ways to do those types of hands. There's no way I'm going to expect you to write out all those thousands of ways. So we're going to learn how to calculate what we're looking at without having to write down all the possibilities. But understanding that there is a sample space and that's where all the stuff comes from is important. The next topic here is something called events. And this is just going to be any set of possible outcomes. So if we take just some of them or even all of them, you take all the outcomes, you take some part of them, that is called an event. So as an example here, an event might be, if you're rolling a dice here, roll an even number. That is something that can happen. And that would correspond to the outcomes 2, 4, and 6. So an event is just take your sample space and take some amount of the outcomes you had there, call it a new thing. Usually we'll use E or F for events, and go ahead and that's now your event there. Okay, so it can be described in words, roll an even number. It can be described in this set notation with these brackets and just listing out which outcomes are part of this event. You can have multiple events. F can be roll an odd number, in which case the event F is 1, 3, and 5. You can have event G that says roll a number bigger than 1. So G would be the event 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So you can create whatever events you want. Just depends on the problem and what you're actually interested in. The last thing in this first part here is called probability. So probability, this is going to be the chance that a given event will happen. Now, this probability can be all sorts of values, and there may be many different ways to calculate these probabilities, and we're going to see future videos where we learn, okay, in this case, this is how you calculate the probability. In that case, that's how you calculate the probability. In this other case, you use this formula and you get the probability. So we're going to learn lots of different ways to find the probabilities. We will talk a little bit basic version of that in this video, but in general, if I write down, say, capital P parentheses E, this is the probability that the event E happens. And then you can have probability of F happens, or G, probability that F happens. And you can have probabilities for whatever event you may want to have. There are 2 restrictions though. So the 2 restrictions for probability is that all probabilities are between 0 and 1. So you can't have a probability that's less than 0%. That would not make any sense for something to happen negative 10% of the time. So we don't have that. You also can't have more than 100% chance of something happening. So we get rid of that. So all probabilities between 0 and 1. And the probability that something happens, whatever it may be, is 100% or is 1. And another way of writing that is the probability of the sample space of all possible outcomes is the number 1. Okay, so you have these different ways to calculate probability. They're always going to be between 0 and 1, and the probability of something happening is always 1. We have a couple of specific words here. When we say a certain event has probability 1. So anytime you have an event and you calculate the probability and the answer is 1, we would say that that event is certain. And really, the only certain event is that something is going to happen. Now, you may have probabilities that are really close to 1, and we might kind of fudge it a bit and call it certain anyways, but by definition, certain has to have probability 1. On the other hand, the exact opposite of that is an impossible event, and that has probability of 0. 0% chance of it happening. And we are going to see different scenarios where that's the case. And once again, sometimes we'll have an event that's probability is just really, really, really low. It's not actually 0, but it's low enough that we might still call it impossible by just kind of approximating it. Something like winning the lottery. Sure, it's not actually 0% chance of happening. It's just so small, we might as well call it impossible. The last one here, this one is kind of the funny business part where we say it's an unusual event, and I'll say has low probability. And then the question is how low probability should it have before we decide to call it unusual? There is no right answer to that. For us, we're going to use less than 5%. So if your probability is less than 5%, we will say it's an unusual event. Doesn't guarantee that someone else is going to agree with that, but that's what we have. Now, the last thing here is we're going to talk about how to find probabilities for very simple cases. So if you have S is your sample space and E is your event, then you can find the probability of E by taking the number of things in E and divide it by the number of things in S. So this only works when you're actually writing down these events. We're going to learn other rules for the more complicated scenarios. But let's say E was roll an even number. We actually did that earlier. Right, we have our E here and we have our sample space. So in this case here, the number of things in E was 2, 4, and 6. There were 3 things there. Number of things in S, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There are 6 things there. And if we divide those, we get a 50% probability for E. So in the case where you actually write out the sample space and you write out the event, you just count how many are in each of them, divide the 2 of them, and that will give you your probability. For the more complicated scenarios, we will have other videos to find them.